There is a place on Earth where the wind blows so hard it can decapitate a man. A place where the temperature drops so low that your teeth can shatter in your jaw. A place where there is no biology, no comfort, and absolutely no mercy. It is the only continent on the planet that actively wants you dead. Antarctica. We like to think of explorers as heroes. We picture them planting flags, taking photos, and drinking champagne. But real exploration is not a victory lap. Real exploration is a slow, agonizing descent into hell. And no story illustrates this better than the 1912 Australasian Antarctic expedition. 3 men set out across the ice. They were young, strong, and prepared. They had the best equipment. They had the best sled dogs. They had a plan. But Antarctica doesn't care about your plan. 35 days into the trip, the ground simply opened up. In a split second, one man, the best dogs, and almost all the food vanished into a bottomless black pit. The 2 remaining men were left standing on the edge of the world. They were 300 miles from safety. They had virtually no supplies. And they had to make a choice. A choice that would lead them down a path of starvation, madness, and body horror so graphic that it sounds like fiction. They decided to eat the surviving dogs. But they didn't know that the biology of a husky contains a hidden, toxic trap. They didn't know that by eating the livers of their faithful companions, they weren't saving themselves. They were slowly poisoning their own brains. This is the story of Douglas Mawson. It is the story of a man whose skin peeled off his body in sheets. A man who watched his companion descend into insanity. A man who hung by a fingertip over a crevasse and decided to pull himself up 1 inch at a time. It is widely considered the greatest story of solo survival in the history of the human race. If you are fascinated by the terrifying limits of the human body and the scientific mysteries of survival, please hit that subscribe ** button right now. You need to hear this story, because it proves that when everything goes wrong, the only thing left to consume is your own will to live. To understand the horror, we first have to understand the isolation. The year was 1912. This was the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. There were no radios, there were no helicopters, there were no satellites. If you got into trouble, you were on the moon. Douglas Mawson was a geologist from Australia. He wasn't looking for the South Pole, he wanted to map the coastline. He was a man of science, not glory. He selected 2 companions for the Far Eastern Party. Belgrave Ninnis, a 25-year-old British Army lieutenant. He was the dog man, the one who took care of the huskies. He was young, wealthy, and cheerful. Xavier Mertz, a 29-year-old Swiss ski champion. He was an elite athlete, strong as an ox and a vegetarian. Together, they were the dream team. On November 10, 1912, they left the main base at Cape Denison. They had 3 sleds and 17 dogs. The plan was to march 300 miles east, map the terrain, and return. For the first month it was perfect. The weather held. They were making great time. They were singing songs in the evenings. They felt invincible. But Antarctica is a trap. It lures you in with silence before it snaps the jaws shut. On December 14, they were crossing a glacier. The snow looked flat, it looked safe. Mertz was in the lead on skis. Mawson was next on his sled. Ninnis was in the rear with the heaviest sled. Mawson looked down as he glided over the snow. He noticed the faint outline of a crevasse, a crack in the ice hidden by a snow bridge. Mawson called back to Ninnis, "Watch out for the crevasse." He didn't think much of it. They had crossed dozens of them already. Mawson kept moving. A few minutes later, he realized it was too quiet behind him. He stopped, he looked back. He saw Mertz staring behind him with a look of absolute horror. Mawson looked past Mertz. The horizon was empty. There was nothing there, no ninnies, no sled, no dogs. Mawson and Mertz ran back. They found a hole in the ice, a gaping wound in the white surface, about 11 feet wide. They crawled to the edge and looked down. It was a black abyss. Far, far below, maybe 150 feet down, they saw a small injured dog whining on a ledge, and next to it, nothing. Just blue darkness. Ninnis was gone. The heavy sled had smashed through the snow bridge and plummeted instantly, taking the young lieutenant with it. Mawson and Mertz screamed his name. Ninnis, Ninnis. Only the echo answered. They stayed by the hole for 3 hours, reading the burial service, hoping for a miracle. But the rope they had was too short to reach him, and the silence from below was final. Ninnis was dead. But as the shock wore off, the reality of their own situation hit them like a physical blow. Ninnis' sled had been carrying the tent. It had been carrying the spade. It had been carrying the waterproof pants. And most importantly, it had been carrying almost all the food. They were left with 1 week's worth of rations for 2 men. And they were 315 miles from base. Even at a record pace, the journey back would take a month. Mathematically, they were dead men walking. They stood on the ice, 2 tiny figures in a continent of death. They made a grim calculation. They had 6 starving dogs left. Mawson looked at Mertz. "We have to go back," Mawson said, "and we have to eat the dogs." For Mertz, the vegetarian and animal lover, this was a nightmare, but he knew it was the only way. They turned their sleds around. They began the death march. The first few days were fueled by adrenaline. They pushed hard. They worked the remaining dogs until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. Then one by one, they killed them. It was a brutal, bloody process. They would shoot the weakest dog. They would butcher it. They would feed the muscle meat to the other dogs to keep them moving. And they, the men, would eat the rest. They ate the paws, they ate the brains, and they ate the liver. They had no idea that this decision, made out of desperation to survive, was actually signing their death warrants. Husky liver is incredibly rich in vitamin A. In small doses, vitamin A is good for you. But in the concentrations found in a sled dog's liver, it is a potent toxin. It causes a condition called hypervitaminosis A. The symptoms are terrifying. Your skin becomes dry and peels off. Your hair falls out. Your joints swell. And worst of all, it affects the brain. It causes irritability, delirium, and madness. As the days went on, Mertz began to change. The strong, Swiss ski champion started to deteriorate rapidly. He became angry. He yelled at Mawson. He complained that the dog meat didn't taste right. Mawson, trying to be a good leader, gave Mertz the best parts of the dog, the liver, thinking it was more nutritious. He was unknowingly feeding his friend a concentrated dose of poison. By New Year's Day, 1913, Mertz was losing his mind. He refused to move. Mawson had to drag him onto the sled. Imagine the scene. Mawson, himself starving and poisoned, his skin was starting to peel too, harnessing himself to the sled like a horse, dragging his dying friend across the ice. One night, Mertz woke up in a rage. He bit off his own finger. He was hallucinating. He was screaming. Mawson had to sit on his chest to stop him from hurting himself. Mertz eventually fell into a coma. On January 8th, Mawson woke up and reached over to touch Mertz. He was cold. Xavier Mertz was dead. Douglas Mawson was now alone. He was 100 miles from safety. He buried Mertz in the snow. He built a cross out of the broken sled runners. He stood over the grave of his friend. Mawson was a man of science, a man of logic. He checked his supplies. He had very little food left. His body was falling apart. The soles of his feet were becoming loose. He sat down and took off his boots. When he pulled off his socks, something horrifying happened. The entire skin of the soles of his feet came off with the socks. It peeled off in a single thick layer, like a soft shoe. Underneath, the flesh was raw, weeping, and agonizingly painful. This was the vitamin A poisoning at work. His body was literally shedding its skin. Most men would have laid down and died right there. The pain of walking on raw flesh is unimaginable. But Mawson was not most men. He took the dead skin. He taped it back onto his feet to act as a cushion. He put his socks back on. He put his boots back on. And he stood up. He cut the remaining sled in half, using a penknife to make it lighter. He harnessed himself to it. And he started walking. For the next 30 days, Douglas Mawson fought a solo war against the Antarctic. He walked through blizzards where he couldn't see his hand in front of his face. He fell into crevasses again and again, but the rope attached to the sled saved him each time. But on January 17, the luck ran out. Mawson was walking on a slick glacier. Suddenly, the snow broke. He fell. He plummeted into a crevasse. He fell 14 feet. The rope snapped tight. The sled, miraculously, had caught on the ice bridge above. Mawson was left dangling in the dark, spinning slowly on the end of the rope. Below him was the abyss, the same darkness that had swallowed Ninnis. Above him was the sled, teetering on the edge. If he pulled too hard, the sled would slide in and he would fall to his death. He hung there for a moment. He was exhausted. He was starving. He weighed less than 120 pounds. He thought it would be so easy to just undo the harness. Just unclip the belt, fall, it will be over in seconds. No more pain, no more hunger. It was the most tempting thought he had ever had. But then he remembered his fiancée, Paquita, waiting for him in Australia. He remembered the promise he made to return. He reached up with his raw, skinless hands. He grabbed the rope, and he began to climb. He pulled himself up inch by inch. His hands were freezing. His gloves were shredded. He reached the lip of the crevasse. He tried to swing his leg over. But the lip crumbled. He fell back down. He fell the full 14 feet again. The shock knocked the wind out of him. He hung there sobbing. "Why?" he screamed. "Why won't you let me die?" He hung there for hours, debating the end. But the cold began to creep into his bones. He knew if he didn't move, he would freeze. He summoned a reserve of strength that shouldn't have existed. He climbed again. This time he moved slower, more carefully. He reached the lip. He kicked his feet into the wall. He rolled over the edge onto the solid ice. He lay there for an hour, too weak to stand, passing out and waking up, just grateful to be on something solid. He crawled back to his half-sled. He set up his tent. He slept for 12 hours. When he woke up, he realized he had conquered the abyss, but he still had miles to go. He marched on. His hair was falling out in clumps. His nails were coming loose. His digestive system was ruined. But he kept moving. On January 29, he saw something in the snow. A cairn, a pile of rocks built by humans. It wasn't a hallucination. He stumbled toward it. It had been built by a search party from the main base who had come out looking for them. They had left a bag of food and a note. The note said, "Aladdin's cave is 23 miles south. The ship is waiting." Mawson wept. He ate the food. It was the first real food he had eaten in months. It gave him the strength to finish. But the Antarctic wasn't done with him yet. A massive blizzard hit. Mawson was trapped in a cave made of ice for a week, just 5 miles from the main base. He sat there, so close he could almost smell the safety, listening to the wind scream, wondering if he would starve on the doorstep. Finally, the wind broke. Mawson emerged. He walked the final miles. He reached the top of a ridge overlooking Commonwealth Bay. He looked down at the ocean. He saw the ship, the Aurora *. But his heart shattered. The ship was sailing away. It was a tiny speck on the horizon, moving toward the open sea. He had missed it by hours. The captain had waited until the last possible moment before the sea ice froze over, but thinking the men were dead, he had given the order to leave. Mawson fired a flare, but it was broad daylight. They didn't see it. He collapsed. He thought it was the ultimate cruel joke. He had survived the crevasse, the poisoning, the starvation, only to be abandoned at the finish line. But then he looked at the hut, the base camp building. There was smoke coming from the chimney. He wasn't alone. 6 men had stayed behind. 6 volunteers had agreed to spend another brutal winter in Antarctica just in case the party returned. Mawson stumbled down the hill. One of the men by curtain saw him. He saw a ghoul, a skeleton wrapped in rags. "My God," by curtain said, "which one are you?" Mawson looked at him with sunken eyes. "I am Mawson." He entered the hut. He was safe. But because the ship had left, he was trapped. Douglas Mawson had to stay in Antarctica for another entire year. He spent the winter healing, writing his journals and grieving his friends. He didn't return to Australia until February 1914. When he walked off the ship, people didn't recognize him. He had aged 20 years. But he was alive. The story of Douglas Mawson is the ultimate gone wrong. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The loss of the sled, the poisoning, the crevasse, the ship leaving. But it is also the ultimate survival. Because Mawson didn't just survive the elements, he survived his own biology. He survived the toxic liver. He survived the skin loss. He literally held himself together when his body was trying to fall apart. In the annals of survival, there are many great stories. Shackleton is famous for his leadership, but Mawson is famous for his solitude. Shackleton had a crew, Mawson had ghosts. He walked through the valley of the shadow of death alone, and he dragged his own corpse out the other side. Years later, Mawson would be knighted. He would become a legend. But he never bragged about it. He simply said, "Providence was with me." Maybe it was Providence, or maybe it was the sheer, stubborn refusal to let the ice win. Call to action. This story is just visceral. The detail about tapping his skin back onto his feet is something I will never unhear. It makes you realize how fragile we are, but also how tough we can be. Do you think you could have kept walking after seeing the ship sail away? Or would that have been the breaking point? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you are blown away by Mawson's grit, please hit that asterisk like asterisk asterisk button and subscribe asterisk asterisk. I have a story coming next week about a man who was swallowed by a hippo and lived to describe the inside of its stomach. Stay safe, watch your footing, and never eat the liver.